There are people in this world who have lived so much life, carried so much history, and survived so many things that most of us will never fully understand, that when you finally hear their story, you do not feel entertained. You feel humbled. You feel the particular kind of quiet that comes when you realize you have been standing in the presence of something extraordinary without knowing it. This is a story about one of those people. A 95-year-old woman named Dorothy Mae Williams, who walked onto the Family Feud stage in the fall of 2024 wearing her Sunday best, smiling at Steve Harvey like she had been waiting her whole life for this moment, and who, in the course of one afternoon, stopped a game show, stopped a studio full of people, and stopped a nation that needed to slow down long enough to look at what was right in front of it. If you have ever believed that it is never too late, that one moment can change everything, and that the oldest among us still have things to teach the rest of us that we have not yet learned, this story is for you. Like this video and subscribe before you go anywhere, because we bring stories like Dorothy Mae's every single week, and you do not want to miss a single one. Now let us meet this woman. Let us give her the full attention she has earned. Dorothy Mae Williams was born in 1929 in rural Mississippi, the third of 7 children in a sharecropping family that worked land they would never own and built a life out of exactly what most people would consider nothing. She grew up during the Great Depression. She came of age during World War II. She raised children during the Civil Rights Movement. She buried a husband, outlived 2 of her own children, survived a house fire, a stroke, and a pandemic that took people half her age. She had seen 10 presidents serve the country she had always loved despite everything it had put her through. She was, by any measure, a woman who had earned the right to rest, to be comfortable, to have a place of her own where she could sit in the morning with her coffee and look out a window at something that was hers. She did not have that. For the past 3 years, Dorothy Mae Williams had been without a permanent home. It had not happened suddenly. It rarely does. It had happened the way most crises happen to elderly people living on fixed incomes, gradually, then all at once. Her apartment in Memphis, where she had lived for 11 years, had been sold to a developer who converted the building into upscale condominiums. The new rent was more than her entire monthly Social Security income. Her youngest daughter, Carolyn, who was 68 years old herself and living on a teacher's pension, had taken her in immediately. But Carolyn's apartment was a 1-bedroom unit with a housing policy that prohibited long-term additional occupants. After 4 months, the building management had issued a warning. Dorothy Mae had quietly packed what she could fit into 2 suitcases and told Carolyn she would figure something out. What followed was 3 years of what housing advocates call the hidden homeless experience, the reality of older Americans who are not sleeping on sidewalks or in shelters, but who are also not, in any true sense of the word, home. Dorothy Mae moved through a rotation of relatives' spare rooms, church friends' couches, and occasional short-term motel stays funded by a collection from her congregation. She never complained. She never told most people what was happening. She continued to show up to church every Sunday in her best clothes, her silver hair pinned neatly, her posture as straight as it had been when she was 40. She brought sweet potato pies to potlucks. She sent birthday cards. She asked after everyone's grandchildren by name. If you did not know what you were looking at, you would have looked at Dorothy Mae Williams and seen a woman who had everything handled. Her granddaughter, 34-year-old Tanya, was the one who knew the full truth. Tanya was a social worker in Memphis who had spent her career helping other people navigate exactly the kind of crisis her grandmother was quietly living. The irony of that was not lost on either of them. Tanya had been trying for 2 years to find a permanent solution, working through waiting lists for senior housing, applying for assistance programs, advocating with a local housing nonprofit. But the systems that existed to help people like Dorothy Mae were overwhelmed, underfunded, and slow in ways that feel criminal when the person waiting is 95 years old. Tanya had applied for Family Feud the previous year as part of a larger plan, to get her grandmother on television, to give her a joyful public moment, and to see what happened when the world got a look at Dorothy Mae Williams and her story. The rest of the family that appeared on stage that day included Tanya's mother, Carolyn, Tanya's younger brother, Deshaun, who was 29 and worked as a mechanic, and Dorothy Mae's great-granddaughter, Amani, who was 19 and in her first year of college studying social work, the same field as her Aunt Tanya, for reasons that would become obvious once you understood this family story. 5 women and men connected by blood and by the particular kind of love that forms when a family has weathered genuine hardship together. They had prepared the way families prepare when they know the stakes. They had practiced. They had prayed. And Dorothy Mae, who had been given no special instructions beyond to have fun and be herself, had simply nodded and said that she had been herself for 95 years and she did not intend to stop now. Steve Harvey noticed Dorothy Mae the moment he walked out to do the pregame introductions. It would have been difficult not to. She stood at the end of the family line in a pale lavender dress that her daughter had bought her specifically for this occasion, with pearl earrings and a small silver cross at her throat. And she looked at Steve Harvey with the kind of calm, unhurried attention that only comes with age. The look of someone who has seen enough of life to know that most things are neither as urgent nor as important as people make them out to be. But that some things are, and those things deserve your full presence. Steve walked to her first. He took her hand in both of his and looked at her for a moment before he said anything at all. "How old are you?" he asked her, his voice already carrying something more careful than his usual opening energy. 95, Dorothy Mae said, and smiled the way she said everything, without any performance attached to it, without waiting to see what reaction she was going to get, simply and directly as a fact. Steve Harvey blinked. 95 years old, he repeated, and turned to the audience for a moment as if checking that they had also heard this correctly. "And you came here to play Family Feud today?" "I came here to win," Dorothy Mae said. The audience laughed. Steve Harvey laughed. And then he did something that was not quite part of the planned pregame format. He pulled a stool close to where Dorothy Mae was standing and sat down on it so that he was closer to her eye level, because even in a moment of warmth and humor, something in him had registered that this was not just a charming elderly contestant. This was someone worth slowing down for. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Where are you from? What is your life like?" Dorothy Mae began talking. She talked about Mississippi. She talked about her husband, James, who had died in 1987, and whom she described with a specific, unsentimental love that made the audience lean forward. The love of someone who has had enough time to see a person clearly and still finds, after all those years, that the sight of them in memory is a source of warmth rather than bitterness. She talked about her children. She talked about her church. She talked the way people talk who have never been trained to perform their stories for an audience, with digressions and tangents and small details that might seem unnecessary but actually contain the whole point if you are listening carefully enough. And then Tanya, standing just down the line, said something that changed the entire afternoon. "Grandma, do you want to tell them where you live?" There was a pause. Dorothy Mae looked at her granddaughter. Something passed between them, a negotiation, wordless and fast, about what was going to be said and what was not. And then Dorothy Mae turned back to Steve Harvey with the same composure she had brought to every other moment and said, simply and without a tremor in her voice, "I don't really have a permanent place right now, to be honest with you. I've been in between situations for a few years." Steve Harvey became very still. In the history of his time hosting Family Feud, he had developed a well-earned reputation for warmth, for reading rooms, for knowing when something real was happening and adjusting accordingly. But the people who watched him in this particular moment said that what moved across his face was different from his usual empathetic response. It was something more than that. It was the response of a man who grew up in circumstances he rarely discussed on television, circumstances that included periods of instability and hardship that had shaped him in ways that most people who knew only his success did not fully understand. Steve Harvey had his own history with the feeling of not having a place to land. And hearing a 95-year-old woman describe that experience with that particular quiet dignity, like it was simply a fact about her life, like she was not asking for anything from anyone, like she had simply answered a question honestly, undid something in him that did not usually come undone on camera. He stopped the game. He did not announce it dramatically. He simply turned to the production team and made the quiet signal that meant hold, and then he sat with Dorothy Mae for a few minutes before they did anything else. He asked Tanya to explain the situation fully. Tanya did calmly, clearly, in the measured way of a social worker who has told versions of this story on behalf of other people hundreds of times, and is now, for the first time, telling it on behalf of her grandmother. She described the apartment that was sold. The one-bedroom Carolyn had taken Dorothy Mae into. The warning from building management. The 2 suitcases. The rotation of couches and spare rooms and motel nights. The waiting lists. The underfunded programs. The 95-year-old woman who had lived through the Depression and the war and the Civil Rights Movement and a pandemic, and who was navigating this final, exhausting chapter of her life with the same composure she had brought to every other one, because that was simply who she was, and because nobody had given her a better option. Steve Harvey listened to all of it without interrupting once. When Tanya finished, He sat with it for a moment. Then he turned back to Dorothy Mae, who had listened to her granddaughter explain her situation with the patient expression of someone who has accepted a long time ago that the world does not always move at the speed you need it to, and asked her one question. "Miss Dorothy," he said, "are you okay?" Dorothy Mae considered this for a moment, in the way she seemed to consider everything without rushing toward an answer she had not yet fully formed. Then she said, "I am still here, aren't I? The Lord has kept me. I am not always comfortable, but I am always grateful. There is a difference between those two things." Steve Harvey pressed his lips together. He looked at the floor for exactly 1 second, then he looked up. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "there absolutely is." What happened in the next few minutes on that stage was the kind of thing that does not happen according to a plan. Steve Harvey spoke to the audience. He did not speechify or preach. He spoke to them the way a person speaks to other people when they are genuinely moved and have decided that performing composure would cost more than it was worth. He talked about Dorothy Mae, about what she represented, about the invisible army of elderly Americans who were quietly navigating instability and housing insecurity without anyone knowing, without complaint, without asking for things to be any different than they were. He talked about dignity. He talked about what it meant that a woman who had been alive for 95 years, who had contributed to her family and her church and her community for almost a century, was sitting in a one-bedroom apartment on a rotation or sleeping on someone's couch, and how that said something, not about Dorothy Mae Williams, but about the systems and structures that were supposed to make sure that something like this did not happen. He was not giving a political speech. He was just saying what was in front of him. He was just describing, plainly and clearly, what was true. And the audience, which had come to watch a game show, sat with all of it in the way audiences sit when they are receiving something they did not expect to receive and are not entirely sure what to do with yet. Then Dorothy Mae spoke again. Nobody had asked her to. She simply had something to say. "I want people to know something," she said, in a voice that was quieter than it had been but no less steady. "Being without a permanent home at my age is hard. I won't pretend it isn't. Some mornings it takes everything I have to get up and keep going. But I want people to look at this family standing here with me." She gestured at Tanya, at Carolyn, at Deshawn, at young Amani, who was already wiping her eyes at the end of the line. "These people have never let me be alone in it, not one day. They have argued with housing offices on my behalf and driven me to appointments and made space for me in their homes when they didn't have space to spare. I am not alone. A lot of people in my situation are alone, and that is the part I want people to think about. Not about me, about them." The studio was completely silent. And then it was not silent at all, because the audience came alive in the way audiences do when they have heard something that cuts through everything and lands directly in the part of a person that recognizes truth on contact. The family played their game. Dorothy Mae was extraordinary, not in the way that surprises people, but in the way that confirms something. She was quick. She was funny. She gave answers that were grounded in a lifetime of accumulated wisdom about what human beings want and need and fear, which, as it turns out, is exactly what Family Feud survey questions are built on. At one point, she gave an answer to a question about things you find in a grandmother's house that got the number 2 spot, and the way she reacted, not with surprise but with mild satisfaction, as if the survey had simply confirmed something she had already known, made Steve Harvey laugh so hard he had to turn away from the camera. Deshawn, the 29-year-old mechanic, was fast and reliable. Imani, the college freshman who was just beginning to build the vocabulary for the kind of work her grandmother's life had inspired her toward, played with a brightness and intensity that spoke to exactly what she was, someone just figuring out what she is capable of. The Williams family did not win their main game. They played well and they fell short by a small margin, and it did not matter even slightly to anyone in the room. Because the game had already been won, in the only way that actually counted. When the taping concluded, the production team stayed in contact with the Williams family. And then something began to happen that was both surprising in its speed and, in retrospect, entirely unsurprising given what the world had just seen. Before the episode even aired, local Memphis news had picked up the story through a source connected to the taping. A housing advocacy organization in Memphis reached out to Tanya directly within 48 hours. A senior living facility in the Memphis area that had a unit available. A real, permanent, one-bedroom apartment designed for independent seniors, with support services attached, reached out, and offered to expedite Dorothy Mae's placement at the top of their waiting list. The facility director later said, in an interview, that she had heard about what Dorothy Mae had said on that stage and had immediately called her executive team and asked one question. What do we need to do to make sure this woman has a home? By the time the episode aired 6 weeks later, Dorothy Mae Williams had a permanent address for the first time in 3 years. She had a window. She had a kitchen where she could make her sweet potato pies. She had a chair by that window where she sat in the mornings with her coffee, which is exactly what she had always deserved, and exactly what had taken far too long to materialize. When a local news crew came to document the moment she moved in, her 2 suitcases finally unpacked, her photographs on the walls, her Sunday dress hung in a real closet, she looked at the camera with the same composure she had brought to everything else and said, "I told y'all the Lord had me. I just didn't know he was going to use a game show to do it." The episode, when it aired, generated the kind of response that the show's producers said they had not seen in years. Not just in viewership numbers, though those were significant, in the nature of what people said and did in response to it. Thousands of viewers reached out to local housing advocacy organizations in their own cities. Senior housing nonprofits reported spikes in donations in the days following the broadcast. Social workers across the country shared the clip of Tanya's explanation of the hidden homeless experience in elderly populations, using it not as a piece of viral content, but as a teaching tool, as a window into a reality that most people had no idea was as widespread as it was. Several state legislators referenced the episode in hearings about senior housing policy, citing it as an example of the human face behind the statistics that too often get discussed in the abstract. Imani, the 19-year-old great-granddaughter who had stood at the end of that family line wiping her eyes, started the second semester of her freshman year with a sharpened sense of purpose. She had grown up watching her grandmother navigate an impossible situation with grace. She had watched her Aunt Tanya fight that same system on behalf of strangers for years. And now she had stood in front of millions of people and seen what happened when one woman's story was finally told out loud. How fast things could move when visibility arrived. How quickly a system that had moved with excruciating slowness for 3 years suddenly found a way to accelerate when people were watching. She made a note of that. She intended to spend her career figuring out how to create that kind of visibility for the people who never ended up on a game show stage. Dorothy Mae settled into her new apartment, received cards and letters from viewers across the country for months after the episode aired. She answered every one of them. She wrote back in a careful, looping cursive, the handwriting of a generation that learned it as a skill and never lost it. And she said the same thing in most of them, in slightly different words each time. That she was grateful, that she was well, and that the most important thing she wanted people to take from her story was not anything about her specifically, but about the people in their own lives and neighborhoods and families who were carrying the same weight without anyone knowing. She asked people to look. She asked them to ask. She told them that most people who are struggling quietly are not going to tell you unless you slow down enough to actually see them. And she told them that most of the time, slowing down is all it takes. Steve Harvey talked about Dorothy Mae in an interview several months after the episode aired. He said that in all his years on that show, across all the families he had met and all the stories he had heard, there were a handful of moments that he carried with him that had changed something in how he thought about his job and his responsibility and what television was actually for at its best. He said Dorothy Mae Williams was one of those moments. He said the thing that stayed with him was not the drama of the revelation or the emotion of the studio or even the outcome, the apartment, the happy ending that felt too neat and too fast given how long it had taken. What stayed with him was what she had said when he asked if she was okay. The distinction she had drawn between being comfortable and being grateful. He said he had thought about that distinction almost every day since. That there was a kind of wisdom in that sentence that he was not sure he had ever heard expressed quite so clearly in quite so few words by anyone of any age. At 95 years old, Dorothy Mae Williams had lived through more chapters of American history than most people will ever read about. She had survived things that had broken people younger and stronger. She had arrived at the far end of a very long life still curious, still generous, still possessed of a specific and private joy that had nothing to do with her circumstances and everything to do with who she had decided, somewhere along the way, to be. She had spent 3 years without a permanent home and had not once allowed that fact to become the whole of her story. And then on a Tuesday afternoon under studio lights, she had told the truth about it simply and without drama, and the truth had done what it sometimes does when you let it out into the open. It moved faster than any system, touched more people than any policy, and got a 95-year-old woman with 2 suitcases and a lavender dress the window she had always deserved. That is what this story is about. Not just the outcome, though the outcome matters and it is right and it should be celebrated. It is about what Dorothy Mae knew that most of the rest of us forget, that your story, told honestly, is never just your story. That the people who are struggling most quietly are almost always surrounded by other people who are also struggling quietly. That the act of speaking the truth, plainly, without embellishment, without performing your suffering for maximum effect, is one of the most radical and powerful things a human being can do. And that at 95 years old, after everything she had survived, Dorothy Mae Williams still had enough left to give the rest of us something to think about. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone in your own life who might be carrying something you have not asked about, or made you want to look a little harder at the people around you who seem like they have everything handled, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of Dorothy Mae's story stayed with you, because this community listens to each other and your voice here matters. And if you are not already with us, subscribe right now, because every week we come back with stories exactly like this one. Stories about the people the world tends to overlook. Stories about what real strength actually looks like. Stories that remind us that the most important things are almost always hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to slow down long enough to see them. We will see you in the next one.